Okay, so I'm going to walk you through some of your practice exercises in your textbook. This is going to be S7-1. We're going to calculate contribution margin per unit, the ratio, and then make some predictions using this contribution margin concept. So what they give you here is they've got some dinner cruises that sell for $50 per passenger. That's your sales price. They give the variable costs are given. This is going to be $20. That's the dinner price per passenger. And the fixed costs, including depreciation, salaries, docking fees, and other, is $210,000 per month. They give you a relevant range of 14,000 passengers. So part one, we're going to get contribution margin per passenger. We're going to get the ratio, and then we're going to make some predictions. So there's 4 parts to this. All the answers are on the next slide, but let me give you the heads up on how to get them. So just remember your sales price of 50. You're going to subtract out your variable cost of 20. That's going to give you a contribution margin per unit of 30. That would be how you would get part A. And then to convert this to a ratio, you just take 30, which is your contribution margin per unit, and divide that by 50. That's going to give you right at 60%. That'll be the answer to how to get part B. And then of course what we'll do then is we'll use these numbers to make predictions. So for example, for part C, it says use this unit contribution margin to project operating income at 11,000. So what you want to do is you want to take that 11,000 passengers, multiply that by the $30 per unit, that's your CM. That would give you total contribution margin, and then you're going to subtract out your fixed cost, which in this case are 210,000. That's how you're going to get your projected profit on part C. But again, I'll show you this in more detail on the next slide. And then it's the same thing. They want basically says use the ratio to project income if monthly sales revenue are 490. So again, what you'll do is you'll take this 490, you'll multiply that by the 60%, which is your ratio. That'll give you your total contribution margin, and then you just subtract out your fixed cost, and that's how you'd get your revenue part of part D. And again, I'll show you this again on the next slide. So as you can see, part A and B, I've already shown you these two. Just go back to the previous slide, but I just showed you these two. And then look at part C. They wanted you to make a prediction. So here's your contribution margin per unit of 30 times 11,000. Notice that's your total contribution margin. You've got your fixed cost of 210. You subtract that, you get a projection of $120,000. Part D, they wanted you to use the ratio. So they gave you 490,000 of sales revenue. You multiply that by the ratio of 60%. That's going to give you right at 294,000. That's your contribution margin. Your fixed costs are still the same. You would subtract that. You'd get a projected income of 84,000. Okay, so on the next 3 slides, we're going to walk you through the answers to S7-2, 7-3, and 7-4. I'm not interested in having you graph anything, so you do not have to worry about graphing. Part 7-2 says using the additional data, they want you to calculate how income is going to increase or decrease if they sold an additional 600 tickets. So what you'll do on that one is you'll take that 600 tickets and you'll multiply that by your contribution margin per unit, which was 30 bucks, and that's going to give you an increase again of 18,000 to contribution margin, which is also an increase to profit. But again, we'll show you this, the official answer on the next slide. And then the next one says they want you to figure out the break-even point. And I'm just going to, again, write out the formula since the data is in the previous slide. Remember, break-even point is what you do is you take your fixed cost and divide by your contribution margin per unit, which we know in this case is 30. And go back to the previous slide, they'll tell you those fixed costs. That'll give you the break-even point in units. And then, of course, you can then take the same thing and divide by 60%, which is the ratio. That'll give you the break even in terms of dollars. Okay, and then finally, on part 4, they want you to figure out if they have a targeted income of 45,000, that's targeted profit. They want to know how many units or tickets you have to sell. That's going to be simple. Your formula is your fixed cost plus your targeted profit divided by 30 because that's your unit contribution margin, and that'll give you your projection and tickets. But again, we'll show you all the numbers on the next couple of slides. So here's the first one. This is your incremental revenue. If you sold an additional 600 passengers, you multiply by the contribution margin per unit of 30, your answer should be an increase of $18,000. And this was your break-even part in part 3. And so again, you had in this case fixed costs. Here's your formula here at the top. Your fixed costs were 210,000 was your fixed cost, and you divide that simply just by 30 because that's your unit contribution margin. That's going to give you a break-even point of 7,000. And then of course, they did give you the sales price, so you could just multiply that by $50. That would give you your revenue, which is right here. Or you could also have taken 210,000, and if you divide that by your CM ratio, which is 60%, that would also give you the same number. So to get the targeted profit in terms of units, you've got fixed, this is S7-4, you take those same fixed cost, add your targeted profit, divide by your unit contribution margin, and the answer should be 8,500 tickets. Okay, so this is illustration for exercise 7.7, and what we're going to do is we're going to change that sales price and the variable cost setup. So part 1, they're going to cut the dinner price from 50 to 40 to try to increase more passengers. They want you to figure out the new break-even point in units and dollars. And just to remind you, so we're going to be using a sales price of 40, and the original variable cost were 20, so that would give you a contribution margin per unit of 20. The fixed cost, just to remind you, were 210,000. That was the fixed cost from the problem. So again, what you'll do is you'll take that 210, divide that by 20. That'll give you the units. Your new ratio is going to be right at 50%, because 20 divided by 40 is 50%. That's your CM ratio. To get the revenue, you could just either take 210, either divide by the ratio, or again, take those same units and multiply by 40. And again, we'll get to this on the next slide, but that's going to be part 1. And then in part 2, it says that assume they do not cut the price. So in part 2, we're going to go back to the same price, which is 50. And instead, it says we're going to reduce the variable expenses from $20 to $10. So notice what happens. That's going to give us a contribution margin unit of 40. And they want you to compute the new break-even point in units and dollars. But notice you got a different contribution margin per unit. In this case, it'd be 40. And of course, the ratio is 40 out of 50. That would give you 80%. We'll do the same calculations. But notice how using sensitivity analysis, how anytime you either change the sales price or the variable cost, anytime contribution margin per unit changes, that's going to change your break-even point. So again, here is part 1. Like I showed you before, the fixed costs were still at 210. And again, if the sales price was 40 and now your variable costs are 20, that would give you a new contribution margin per unit of 20. So again, that's your denominator. The answer would be 10,500. And then also notice your ratio, your CM ratio is 20 divided by 40, or 50%, or 0.50. Again, down here, you could just take 210 fixed, divide by the ratio. That would be your new break even in terms of revenue. And then the third part is they keep the sales price the same. So sales price was at 50, and now variable costs are going to be at 10. So your new contribution margin is 40. So you're going to take those fixed costs, divide by 40. That's going to give you 5,250. And remember, your CM ratio is 80%, because 40 over 50 is 0.8. So then to get the revenue part of it, you just take the 210 and divide that by your CM ratio. And on the next slide, that'll be the revenue part of it. Or actually, it's showing here right here. Or probably the fastest way is you could also just take the 5,250 and then just multiply by the sales price of 50. Either way, you're going to get the same answer of 262,500. All right, so this will be for a 7-8. They're going to change the fixed cost from the same problem. So just to kind of remind you, the sales price, the original sales price was 50. The variable cost was 20. So the CM per unit, I believe, was at 30 bucks. So now the fixed costs are going to be at 180. They want you to get the break-even point in units and dollars. It's going to be the same formula. Remember, you'll just take 180 because that's going to be your fixed cost. Divide that by 30. That'll be the new break-even point. And then notice your CM ratio is changing. Now your CM ratio is going to be at 60%. So then you can convert that to your revenue by taking 180 divided by 0.6, or just take these units times the sales price. Either way, I'm going to show you this on the next slide, but that's going to give you part 1. And then obviously the question says, is the break-even point higher or lower than an S7-3? Well, remember, they lowered fixed costs, so you do not have as many fixed costs. So think about how that's going to affect break-even. If you don't have as many fixed costs to cover, you don't have to sell as many units. So think about that relationship, because since you're lowering cost, your break-even point should actually go down. So as you can see here at the top, notice it's going to be 180,000 divided by 30. The new break-even point was 6,000. I believe the original break-even point was 7,000. So notice that the break-even point did in fact go down. And again, this slide is just showing you a couple different ways and how you can get the revenue part of it. So either you take the 6,000 passengers, multiply that by the sales price, or you could also just divide by that CM ratio, which is what they're doing right here. And you notice you also get the same answer. And then finally here at the top, they're just basically showing you the requirement to notice the break-even point did go down. You basically reduced your cost. That means you have less cost to cover. You actually reduced it by 1,000 passengers. Okay, so 7-9 is going to be a product mix problem where you have multiple products. In this case, they've got a regular cruise and executive cruise. You're going to have two different contribution margin per units, and the mix is going to be right down here. They tell you that they sell four regular cruises for every executive. So it's basically a 4-to-1 ratio. So in this problem, we're going to do some weighted average calculations. We're going to calculate the break-even point using that weighted average contribution margin per unit. So here we got the data. We've got the regular cruise. We've got the sales price of 50. Subtract out the variable cost of 20. That gives you unit contribution margin per ticket of 30. For the executive, it's 130 minus 40. That gives you 90. You multiply by the weights. So it's 4 regular cruises for every one. So 30 times 4 is 120. Executive, 90 times 1 is 90. You add those together, you get 210 total contribution margin. You divide that by 5, you would get a weighted average contribution margin per unit of 42. Now then, if you wanted to figure out the break-even point, this is going to be your denominator, and then later on we can go back to the mix to figure out how much of each should you sell. Okay, so in 7-10, it's basically a continuation of 7-9. Remember, we had a weighted average CM per unit right at $42. That was, again, our weighted average CM per unit. And they want you to figure out the break-even point and then how much of each the regular and the executive you need to sell. So just remember, you're going to take those fixed costs and first of all divide by the weighted average CM, and then we're going to go back to that 4-to-1 ratio to figure out how much of each product you need to sell. Again, we'll show you these calculations on the next slide. So here's your total break-even. The fixed costs were $210,000 divided by your weighted average CM per unit, which is 5,000. So remember, it was a 4-to-1 ratio. So again, for the regular and executive. So for the regular, it's going to be 4/5, and for the executive, it's going to be 1/5. You're going to multiply each of those by the 5,000, and what that's going to give you is they're showing you the answers right down here. For regular, it's going to be 4,000 tickets, and for the executive, it should be 1,000. Okay, so this is going to be 7-11. This is going to be margin of safety. And just to kind of remind you, we've actually already done the calculations. Remember, the break-even point was right at 7,000 units. Again, this was from the original data. But what they want you to calculate is the margin of safety in units and dollars, and also as a percentage of sales. We'll show you all the calculations again on the next slide. So notice, first of all, to get the margin of safety in units, if they're selling 8,750 and the break-even point was 7,000, all you have to do is subtract. So in this case, the margin of safety is going to be right at 1,750. Now, again, if you wanted to convert these into dollars, the fastest way to do it in this case, if we know that the sales price was 50, you could just take 1,750 and multiply that by $50. That's going to give you your number, which should be right at 87,500. And then the last thing is to express it as a percentage of sales. They're doing it in dollars, but I'll show you a faster way. If you just take the units of 1,750 and divide that by 8,750, just keep units and units together, it's like units, that's going to give you the percentage as well, which is going to be part C. Okay, so this is exercise 7.12. We're going to calculate operating leverage. And so in this case, we're using this for the Crystal Cruise Lines. And again, we're going to use this at a volume of 8,750. So just to remind you, again, the sales price was 50. The variable cost was 20, which means that the contribution margin per unit was 30. So what we're going to first have to do is we're going to calculate what the net income was at 8,750. So what we'll do is we'll take that unit contribution margin. We're going to multiply it by this volume. We're going to then subtract out the fixed costs, which were 210. That's going to give us our net income. And then I'll show you again how to get that factor. And then we'll do some sensitivity analysis by increasing or decreasing these volumes to show you how you can figure out the impact on profit. So again, here at the top, we're showing you how to get your operating income. Here's the 8,750. That's your contribution margin per unit. That gives you total contribution margin of 262,500. Your fixed cost were 210. You subtract that, you get your net income, which is 52.5. So to get your factor, here's the formula to get the factor. It's 262.5, which is your CM. Divide that by your net income of 52.5. Your factor is going to be 5. So then you're going to use this factor. All you do is multiply by the increases or decreases in volume. So if volume increases by 10%, you multiply that by 5. That's going to give you an increase of 50%. That's right here. And if it decreases by 5%, again, you multiply that by 5. That's going to give you a decrease, in this case, of 25% in terms of your profit. Okay, so this is going to be for 719A. We're going to look at break even and targeted profit. This is a company that produces sports socks. They've got fixed cost of 90, variable cost of 0.90, and a selling price of $1.80. So to write down the notes, we've got, again, selling price of $1.80, variable cost of 90. So that gives you a contribution margin per unit right at 90 cents. Our CM ratio is going to be 50% because 90 divided by $1.80. So again, CM ratio is right at 50%. So again, to get the break even, to get the contribution margin per unit, which I just showed you is 90 cents, the ratio is going to be 50%. That's part one. And then of course, to get part two, to get the break even point, we'll take those same fixed costs. We'll divide by each of these. We'll divide by the 90 cents and the 50% to get part two. Again, I'll show you this on the next slide. And then we'll use the exact same formula, except we're going to plug in a targeted profit of 18,000, and we'll show you how you can get your number of packages. So again, here at the top, I just showed you this, but here's going to be your contribution margin per unit. Again, sales price minus variable cost is CM per unit. And then again, if you take 90% divided by 180, that's going to put you right at your CM ratio, which is 50%. So then now on part two, to get the break-even stuff, you can take the fixed cost, divide by your CM per unit. It's going to be 100,000 packages. And then to get that in terms of dollars, take this same formula, divide that by 50%. That'll give you the same number in terms of dollars. And then, of course, I ran out of space in the last slide. But again, here's that second part. Here's the fixed cost divided by the ratio. So it'd be $180,000. Or alternatively, you could have just taken the number of packages and multiplied it by the sales price, which in this case was $1.80. That's another way to get the $180,000. And then part three, if you have a targeted profit of 18,000, you take the fixed cost of 90 plus the targeted profit of 18, divide by the unit CM, you need to sell 120,000 packages.